Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you to the Tax Policy and State Budget Priorities, a Perspective from the General Assembly session. Should be a lot of fun as we hear from two folks in the General Assembly who play significant roles in tax policy and the budget in Richmond. And so I'm Jeff McKay. I'm the president of ACO and chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. And my job is pretty simple here, which is to moderate and to invite our speakers. And this is a informal session looking to be conversational. And so I'd ask you, after we have brief remarks from both of our speakers, if you have questions, we want to encourage that conversation. And so there are microphones in the room. Make sure, if you can, go to the microphone to ask your question, because we do have people watching this virtually. And also, of course, these sessions are recorded so that folks can go back and review them later. So I want to make sure we hear your questions. But I want to start by introducing Delegate Vivian Watts. And Delegate Watts represents the 39th District in the House of Delegates and is the longest serving woman in the House of Delegates. She's the policy chair for the House Democratic Caucus. She currently chairs the House Finance Committee and serves on the House Courts of Justice, Transportation, and Rules Committees. Among many legislative appointments, she serves on the Behavioral Health Commission, the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates, and with me on the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. She previously served as Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety, as well as Executive Director of a nonprofit serving over 650 children in abuse and neglect cases annually. And importantly to us, she is always, as Senator Hanger is, who we'll hear from in a moment, always very generous with her time for VACO, but also her time. And I can say this as someone from Northern Virginia, and she represents part of Fairfax County, is always very generous with her time with individual supervisors and cares deeply about local government issues. So you join me in welcoming Delegate Vivian Watts.
Thank you very much, and Chairman McKay. That's all past history. But while we're on past history, there is one thing that I will add to that past history, and that is 15 years as a citizen, very active in Fairfax County when we were building a classroom a day for more than a decade, and very active because I'm a numbers person at heart, and how in the world do we afford this? And this is so pertinent to what we're talking about today. Now, looking forward, I am speaking as Vivian Watts, the intrepid tax nerd. I cannot guarantee that anything that I say will come about, except that I really welcome this opportunity to place some of these things on the table. As I have said more than once over the last 2 years, when I had the unexpected opportunity, I mean, God's plural up there are having fun with me. I didn't think I'd have the opportunity to chair the Finance Committee, which in the House is solely tax writing. Really dug into it, in part because of COVID, and also in part, as I see it, 20 years of no meaningful tax reform to reflect our economy, as well as the demographics of the ability to pay, as well as our tax system, which so often, in so many ways, is still a colonial-based tax system on the real estate tax. I was given 2 years. I wanted more. I really didn't expect it to be over with. So God's continue to have fun with me, and we'll see what still comes of everything that I have said. That doesn't change for a moment the need that we have for tax reform, for the robust economy, as well as the equity and fairness, both in individuals' ability to pay, as well as the perennial problem that has existed for decades in Virginia and will continue to exist, which is the spread between wealth and poverty in our jurisdictions, as we have tried to address it again and again and again. So I was asked particularly, there are a couple of things that I did get started as I have stirred the pot, and another phrase that I will use, I have said to many a person, I represent the impatience of age, not of youth. I want it done. And these are the kinds of things that are ongoing. You all know that 2 years we gave counties virtually the same ability to tax as cities have had for almost 100 years. So hopefully you look at some of those opportunities, particularly with the meals tax and the tobacco tax, as ways of relieving a little bit of the pressure on the real estate tax. It still doesn't come close to the school funding formula, which has 40% ability to pay, but not the ability to tax that adjusted gross income in an equity way through the real estate tax, which 10, 15 years after the person has lived in the house no longer really reflects, in many cases, their ability to pay, which puts a tremendous amount of stress on your decisions as members of the Board of Supervisors of how to pay for the necessary services, again, particularly in growth pressure areas, which I refer back to. That's what I cut my teeth on well before I ever thought that a woman would run for office. So what we have done in addition to that, with working closely with Senator Hanger, thank God, so that we were able to get it done. I also have a JLARC study that was authorized in the last General Assembly session about the equity of the Virginia individual income tax. As long as I have been on the House Finance Committee, which is virtually my entire years of service, by choice, not by punishment, but by choice, that I thought I knew a lot more about a lot of details on a lot of different taxes. But starting when COVID hit in April of 2020, I began looking at what options we might have in funding should the COVID economy tank. And what I had found increasingly is that too often the legislature is at the mercy of the governor, who's only serving 4 years, on what I call a bumper sticker idea for tax reform or taxes. And I wanted to be in a position so that as a member of the legislature, I could respond as, in Virginia's tax structure, in Virginia's economy, this is the most important direction that we could go towards equity and reflection of a modern economy. Well, when I presented that initial look to Chairman Janet Howell, her reaction is, well, what about the income tax? Get back to you, Janet. Next week, I'll give you another white paper. Well, 5 weeks later, I came back to her with complexities within the Virginia income tax, individual income tax, that I quite frankly was not that attuned to the circles within circles within circles that any bumper sticker solution sometimes makes worse with unintended consequences. For all intents and purposes, almost 80% of Virginia's budget is driven by the Virginia individual income tax. That is far too much reliance on one form of taxation for any good tax policy, because it's too much affected by specific things that might happen in the economy, and the broader base that you have your taxes, the more resilient you can be. I would say off the top, 15 to 20% of that individual income tax is actually a tax on small businesses, some of them not so small, S corporations, et cetera. And so we are unaware, as we look just at the corporate income tax, which is a whole different legal structure, of what we are doing as far as business taxation from Main Street to the high suite offices that exist in some of our urban cores where we have partnerships, et cetera. It is worthy of a full study to make sure that we understand all of those ramifications. But let me point out 2 things. And on this one, I'm going to leave this one copy up there. If you're interested in having a copy of this white paper, Just write your email down. I'll leave it on the board, on the table, and that will be the easiest way for me to send you a file on this white paper. You will see a fair amount of the points raised in the resolution that passed this JLARC study. But two things that I want to particularly highlight that seem to be lost so often in discussions, and that is that Virginia is one of only 4 states that has a 0 tax bracket. So when you hear that we start taxing people, oh my God, at 2%, at $3,000 income, well, that is after the 0 tax bracket, as well as personal and standard deductions. So that we're really looking at starting that, give or take, in the $25,000 range of taxable income. And that's important, one of only 4 states, and that 0 tax bracket hasn't been changed since 2012. So equity could very definitely be addressed at that end, while we also consider that our top tax bracket starts at 25,000 plus 17,000, starting at, give or take, around $40,000 of income 5 3/4. Should that be added to? Well, that's the other factoid that I want to take these introductory comments to make sure that I underscore. One of the things that I found in the research that I was doing, and wasn't the isolation of COVID wonderful when you just, at least in my case, sit there at my basement on my computer. And by the way, somehow my husband and I are still married after all of that just being together. That one of the things that I discovered in the research was that Virginia is second only to California in the spread between cost of living. It's not just a matter of wealth and poverty. Apply to that wealth cost of living. Second only to California. Why does that matter in tax policy as well as the school funding formula, where we get so much of the state sharing of funds with localities? It matters because school funding formula doesn't reflect that in any meaningful way. Meanwhile, our taxes are being raised based on that high standard of living, essentially, give or take, 135% in the Northern Virginia area, driven mostly by housing. So that when you are looking at the upper bracket and whether or not you either raise it or add another bracket, you have to keep in mind that a basic income of, let's say, household income of $60,000 in most of the state has to be at least $80,000 in Northern Virginia for the basic living that we are talking about. And let me just say one more thing on the school funding formula, which unfortunately, according to the preliminary report of the JLARC staff, even though our initial conversations had been that the school funding formula was a very important part of this study, apparently how money is spent is not going to be a part of the study. And I'm not ready to say no on that by any means. Because what happens in the school funding formula, where 40% is driven by adjusted gross income and you can't touch it, is that while state police for decades have gotten, give or take, 25% salary increase when they are assigned to Northern Virginia, when you go through the LCI, teachers in Northern Virginia increase is 2%. So that also then becomes a matter of how do we adjust ability to pay, as well as looking at the equity of a broader base of ability to pay, so that we can really reach it in, again, something that reflects today's economy and the robustness. As far as other work being done, at this point, the Senate Appropriations Finance Special Committee of a Tax Overview has not met, so I'm not quite sure where they're going. In my ego, and I own it, I'm saying, oh, when that came in the budget language, they'll get to the point that I did in my basement on the 2 white papers, both in terms of what our options are, as well as looking ahead. As far as, I won't get into the unitary multi-state taxing combined. Trust me, if you want an answer, I'll give it in too much detail in the question and answer. And then finally, let me take a couple of minutes in wrapping up to just address what I see in day one white paper information about what's going to happen in tax cuts in Virginia. And clicking it on down, if I'm going to fund the extreme need, and again, I keep on underscoring a classroom a day for more than a decade, schools that are 40 and 50 years old plus that were built pretty fast and not always as well as they might have been. I know the cost of replacing. I know that there are schools we are talking about that are 70 and 80 years old, but this is an extreme cost. But this is where I would put my surplus money as one time rather than working it into and then decide when we do a catch up as to whether or not there needs to be additional state or local funding for that revenue stream, always respecting the power of the highest possible bond rating that you can get. As far as cutting the food tax, again, we have tried to do that for years and years and years and years. And the reason it's only 2.5% is because of the local and the 1% that comes back to localities based on school age population. For all intents and purposes, we're talking about a penny and a half absolutely being school funding, where half of most local budgets are school funding, and the transportation. The costs are really underestimated when you look only at the state as opposed to also local. I would submit to you, and this is where I could go on for another 5 minutes, that one of the big things that I found in my initial look about Virginia's tax system and what we might be responding to is that we are one of the few states that does not tax consumer services. We tax the laundry soap and we don't tax the cleaners. And we're one of the few states, as J. Lark pointed out way back in 2012, in 1970s, the average household began spending more on services than goods, and we still regressively only tax goods. So I have a fully developed alternative that would raise, depending upon how you adjust other tax issues, at least 800 million up. It would apply to the local retail sales tax base as well, and could be a trade-off for the food tax if you really are interested in moving the needle towards equity. This would go a long way as far as the average household is concerned. So I've certainly thrown out a lot, brought to you by Vivian Watts, the individual.
Thank you very much, Delegate Watts, and we love our tax and budget nerds here. So, and I think Vivian, there are a few people that know more about the ins and outs of state tax policy than Vivian, and I think we just saw why. I do want to remind everyone our session goes until 12:45, so we're going to hear from Senator Hanger for 15-20 minutes, and then we'll make sure we have time for your questions here at the end. And it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Hanger. Senator Hanger has represented the 24th Senate District since 1996. His district includes parts of Culpeper County, all of Madison County, parts of Rockingham County, and all of Augusta and Greene counties, including the cities of Stanton and Waynesboro. And you notice I said Stanton, right? I know where Stanton is. He previously served as Commissioner of the Revenue and in the House of Delegates. In the Senate, he served as Senate Finance Co-Chair, a Budget Conferee, and Chair of the Health and Human Services Finance Subcommittee. He's very involved in all aspects of the legislature and has become an ardent supporter of all matters dealing with education, mental health, and the environment. He holds several positions on national organizations such as the Southern Legislative Conference and the National Conference of State Legislators. And I know I've had the pleasure year after year after year of hearing him here at VACO. Has been very generous with his time for us at the county level. Please join me in welcoming Senator Emmett Hanger.
Thank you, Jeff. And Vivian, good to be here with you today. And thank everyone for being here in this session. The important session, quite frankly, between what Vivian shared and what Jeff Shapiro shared this morning, I'm not sure, I wasn't sure where to go. Actually, after Jeff talked this morning, he was very kind to me in his remarks, quite frankly. He's normally not kind to anyone. He just, he'll step all over your toes. At any rate, so after Jeff's session, I actually went back to my room and reworked the direction that I was going to come from. So at any rate, there's some remarks I want to make. I've been on a soapbox for some time of trying not to moderate my positions, but just to try to make people come back and get together and work things out, as opposed to this partisan divide that we have, which, we watched it in Washington for a while, and we were somewhat amused by that, and then it began to hurt by the consequences of their actions and inactions up there with the partisan divide. And then we discovered that we weren't immune from it in Richmond. It's pervasive now in Virginia politics, and you all are out there on the front lines a lot, and you well understand that. First, let me thank you all and thank Vivian. As it happened, the pendulum swings. The pendulum swang back for Vivian. Well, the pendulum swang back for me a couple years ago, because I was able to sit in the middle of the finance committee table occasionally, and now I go down more toward the end. But still have a place, and so that's all. If you're in the room, you have a place in decision making, and that's where I find myself right now. Also, Jeff, I believe you were moderating maybe the last session I had out at the homestead. My years get confused, as all of us do, with the COVID experience, but I do recall in that meeting, somewhat made a pledge to you all that the timing was right, that we were going to get the equalization of taxing authority for counties with cities, and we did that. And certainly, in fact, early on, I met with Vivian, and at the General Assembly building, we actually went down to the Philip Morris plant and talked to our tobacco folks, and basically, they realized where we were going, and they basically backed off from a super amount of resistance. They had some issues with it, but we worked it out. We still haven't totally resolved, just got a report on how we can make and modernize the collection of that tax. And I know some of y'all are struggling with that with your regional entities that you're setting up, some of them based on the Northern Virginia model, which I think works fairly effective. But there's still some things we do. A lot of antiquated equipment and all kinds of problems out there, and we need to fix that. But I'm glad we cleared that hurdle. But to this notion that I have, and I think I might have shared some of these thoughts with y'all, but I want to share with you all some of those of us that are given the opportunity to be representatives of the people, to make decisions collectively in the best interest of the people we serve, where we should be coming from politically. So I'm just going to quickly share this as part of, I'm co-chair of the Commonwealth Caucus right now, where we're trying to forge some alliances which will help us to minimize the impact of politics. You can't take it all out, nor should you perhaps take it all out. It's a way of our system operates. The first principle is we should strive to put the public interest ahead of any partisan or special interest, and government should represent we the people, not the party leaders or those who can buy access to power. That's always a struggle. Second, we should try to use common sense and find common ground to solve problems by rejecting the partisan divide and instead working together as Democrats and Republicans in an inclusive and civil manner to get things done. Third, we should stand for the timeless values of opportunity, equality, and stewardship, empowering every Virginian to realize their full potential, upholding equal rights for all under the law, which ultimately will leave a stronger state and country for the next generation. And fourth, we all should champion integrity, transparency, and accountability in politics by seeking to rebuild America's trust in government by holding ourselves to the highest standards of honor and honesty and fixing the broken incentives that contribute to political dysfunction. And finally, it's a shared responsibility for those as elected and for the people we represent to be informed and engaged on these issues. And so those are some thoughts that I continue to keep in the back of my mind. and we all need to work on trying to observe those as much as is possible. Now, since I reworked my format, I can only deliver from an outline when I've run it through my computer and print it off in 24-point font. And so when I just write something out, I have to put my glasses on to see what I just wrote. So here we go. I'm going to, Vivian went through some of the taxing issues. I'm going to first go through some of the spending priorities, which is a part of our session, and double back to some of the tax policy. First, education. We should not mistake, campaigns are campaigns, but the truth of the matter is, I've been active with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Southern Conference, and we were able to get back together with the Southern Legislative Conference in person this year. And as I sat on the education reporting card, the report card for the 15 Southern states that are part of that, I was proud. You know why? On every metric that was presented, Virginia was head and shoulders above our sister states throughout the South. One exception to that, we were good on the money spent in total. Our low grade came from the amount the state puts in versus the amount that local governments put in. Well, that's something y'all can relate to, isn't it? That was a gig, but we have a good system. So I only say about education, it's a large budget. It's the largest between K-12 and higher education, and we will be spending more money. So we'll talk about is a surplus. A significant amount of money will go there, as it should. Both of the campaigns this year pledged increases in spending. The trick, of course, will be as we put additional money there, the strings we might attach for what we mandate that you do in order to receive that money. So we have to keep an eye on us on that particular issue. Health and Human Resources is something that I've dealt with significantly. In fact, I still co-chair that subcommittee of finance with the chair, Janet Howe. Medicaid has, as a budget item, is huge, but because of some of the reforms we've made, the expansion that we made, through which now has over 500,000 members in that program, and some of the federal policies through COVID, we actually are in good shape. It's not going to be a big increase there. In fact, it's contributing to the bottom line. Really, has helped us create some surplus because of the fact that we have been eligible for these for the additional incentives from the federal government. Mental health, our mental health delivery system obviously will be a big driver of our decision-making process there, as is always, and it's one of y'all's hot button issues, the Children's Services Act, or the Comprehensive Services Act, as it initially was known. Natural resources is another area that I focus on quite a bit. We are obviously needing to work on water quality, and we've made some decisions over the last several years that impact our budget significantly in Richmond and yours. I carried a bill last year, in fact, for a significant additional upgrade in our wastewater treatment facilities, which the state tab for that is going to be in the range of $300 to $400 million. Your tab is going to be collectively is going to be about $500 million as we upgrade, do additional upgrades. Another area where I see us needing to put additional dollars is invest management practices for the ag industry, where as we try to meet our goals by 2025, we're going to need to basically come up with, my ballpark figure is about $100 million per year in order to reach our goals. So as we look at a 2-year budget, I wanted to see us, and I've discussed this with the governor's office, $100 million a year put in that program. And some commitment for the out years too, whether we put it in our natural resources commitment fund or whether we just make that commitment that we will go there, an additional $200 million, a total of about $400 million over the next 4 years for best management practices in that arena. We've done well with land conservation in that area, but and there are some who want dedicated funding sources for that. And I would also say that there are some, in fact, there's kind of a groundswell of support coming for new dedicated funding sources for our state parks. Really proud of our state parks. We've been expanding the opportunities throughout the state, building additional ones, upgrading, but we've not kept pace with our commitment for operations for our state parks. So I think that should be high on our list of priorities for additional funding for our state parks. Not, in my opinion, not a good year to say we're going to come up with additional fees and taxes, but rather make the commitment that it's a general fund responsibility and put the money there. You know, Loudoun County has received a lot of attention in the campaigning of late, but we've acquired with the assistance of the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors a new park site up there, kind of adjacent to Harper's Ferry. And I'm anxious for us to make a commitment to putting money in to develop that park up there in Loudoun County, because I think it will be a huge asset for the needs, recreational opportunities and needs of Northern Virginia. So that's where I would hope we can put some additional money. Transportation, obviously, and I'll speak to that on tax policy, but we still have significant need there. An area where I think it's important, or we have an opportunity to save a significant amount of money down the road. I had an opportunity to chair, actually I moderated a forum, the National Conference of State Legislators, actually it was 2 days after the election. Funny story about that. One of my panelists that I was supposed to have presenting was the director for the Senate Majority Leader in New Jersey. Guess what? They were still counting votes and he didn't show up. So at any rate, back to Virginia. That was kind of an aside there, but back to Virginia. You may recall it's been about 9 years ago, we made a commitment to basically provide a method of funding our underfunded system, where we had used the retirement system in previous years as kind of a piggy bank if we needed to make adjustments and what have you. Well, we made that commitment working with the Senate, working with the House. Delegate Chris Jones at that time was very heavily involved with that. And we made it, which was essentially roughly a 20-year commitment. And we're about 8 years into that, where we basically have kept our pledge to stay on course, and all going well, we will have get to 100% by the year 2043. Well, here's what we can do. We got some extra money there. I think the issue of unfunded issues that contribute to the fact that maybe we don't have a surplus, we could put some serious money. We could put $100–200 million of this money that we have on the table right now into the retirement system, and it would save us actually huge money. It's surprising, the multiplier effect of the interest in the out years. If we were to do that, it would be a significant savings in getting us back on track for 100% funding of our retirement system. So needless to say, I'm going to be a proponent of that, and I hope we will be able to address that, and that will help us all. Public safety, big issues there. It's another one of those areas where, you know, we struggle between state policy and local governments, where your jails are overfilled because we don't take care of our state responsible prisoners, and we give you a little bit of money, which you're happy to get sometimes when you've got empty cells, but then when you're full and have to consider building additional jail capacity, it's not a good thing. So that's an issue we're going to have to address. Two more areas of spending and where we need some reform. Economic development. We actually been very fortunate with economic development over the last several years, and our economy has responded well in relation to that. We've had some high profile successes such as Amazon in Northern Virginia, but we've also had some really good ones throughout the state that are helping our bottom line as far as our revenue resources. Tourism is one that got hurt significantly during COVID. So I'm actually a proponent of us going back, and this is perhaps what we can do with some of the monies from the American Recovery Plan to further help our tourism industry get back on its feet. That's something that I think is important for us to do. Another critical area between state and local is our funding of constitutional officers and the functions of the state comp board. I think we need to go back and revisit that in terms of how that comp board functions. So that's something that's on my radar for this year, and we will see how that works. Now on tax policy, or Jeff, I want it to be an interchange. I've still got a little time to okay, because here's where I'll get in trouble, but that's where I'm at. Jeff talked about the car tax, which is still on our table. We haven't figured out what to do. I was in the Senate, a fairly new member of the Senate, when Jim Gilmore made his proposal. Well, I didn't like it, but I found myself on my side of the aisle being the only one that didn't like it. So there were 21 Republicans, 19 Democrats. So I went over to the Democrats in the Senate and said, hey, I will vote with y'all, because Lieutenant Governor's a Democrat. I will vote with y'all. We don't have to do this. It's not fair. Well, I didn't get traction. I hadn't been in the Senate that long. I'm not sure they trusted me. But the other point was, for you folks in Fairfax, most of that money was going to come to you all, okay? And for most of rural Virginia, you're going to be on the short end of the stick because of the way the deal was cut. So anyway, when it came up, I still voted against it. And Dick Saslaw reminds me about that at least once a year about that. And he actually admits, we should have voted with you, you know, even though I understand the political consequences for their constituency in Northern Virginia. So fast forward now, I was also involved very heavily. I sponsored the legislation that created the Tax Reform Commission with Bob McDonnell. And we worked and we actually accomplished some things which were significant. We began working on the Streamlined Sales Tax Project, which led ultimately to being able to have sales tax on the internet, but it took a long, long time to get there. We also means tested our age deduction. We actually took part of the sales tax off of food, got us down to the 2.5%. My goal at that time was to take it all off, but not at the cash register, to basically allow an allowance on your tax return. Because I thought, you know, we want to have somewhat of a progressive system, but the folks that are more affluent spend a whole lot more on groceries than those on the lower end of the spectrum. But the folks on the lower end of the spectrum spend a disproportionate amount of their total income on groceries. So my idea was you would have an allowance on your income tax return based on size of family and amount that you would get a credit back, which could be refundable. We didn't go there, but we did reduce it to 2.5%. We did a number of other things, but some of the things just did not get traction, and we hung the General Assembly up during the Warner administration, you recall. In fact, the times that we did hang the General Assembly up and went into special session, I think I was in the middle of all of them, but don't tell anybody that. They'll think it was my fault. But we did it. We resolved it, and then the same thing happened with Medicaid expansion, but we resolved it eventually. So here we are on taxes. I think, and it was the policies we adopted back then, they should be simple, fair, adequate, and cost-effective. Those are the general platform for tax policy. Now, some people, I spoke to a group one time, and I was asked to speak about taxes, and I talked for about 15, 20 minutes, and a guy got up and raised an objection in the back. It kind of at the height of the no tax movement and what have you, and the anti-taxers, and he said, can you talk about something besides taxes? I'm tired of hearing about taxes. I don't like taxes. Well, y'all got to deal with that, don't you? Yeah, that's what you have to do. We need to make some changes, I guess. And one of the things I meant to speak to in terms of the on the cost side of the ledger on budgeting is the Composite Index. And Vivian mentioned that briefly. One of the things that as we visit that, and it's a sticky wicket, we really do need for rural counties to be able to, in my opinion, move forward with that formula being based on land use values rather than market values, because you don't have access in your budget to the market value. It's land use if you're committed to that and you're long-term committed to that. But that's an issue that we're going to have to address. Maybe I should reserve time here with you all to respond to, I was going to go down the checklist of Governor-elect Youngkin's proposals, but let me just do one of them right now, and that being eliminating the food tax. Vivian clearly detailed why that's difficult, why it 2% of it hits you all right squarely, the other 0.5% on transportation. There's a way of doing it, but I'm not sure we can get there. In order to do it, I believe we would need to increase the sales tax and or expand services to services, as Vivian was indicating. We've had, over the last several years, there was a movement. It began, Halifax might have been the first one to do it, to say, okay, we need money for school construction and repairs maintenance. So the Assembly passed authorization for a handful of localities through referendum to impose an additional 1% sales tax. And that went through routinely at first, and then people, and I voted against them, and people couldn't understand why I was voting against it. My opinion on that is that it has the potential for further increasing disparities. If you're a rural locality that happens to have a Walmart in there rather than being in the incorporated city, you can fare reasonably well. If you don't have a Walmart, I'm using that as shorthand for, large retail center, then maybe not so. And then as all the localities, of you more affluent localities, Fairfax, realize that you could do that. So you put another 1% and you keep it all in Fairfax. Well, my preference would be, if we're going to go down this road of removing the sales tax on food, that we expand, that we do that 1% statewide, and then it be redistributed back to the localities based on the composite index, something of that sort, with broad authority for the local government to use that for educational purposes, school construction, maintenance, or whatever. But that's just a thought on that particular item. The other area that I'll just state a position on is we fought long and hard to try to get adequate funding streams for transportation. And we made mistakes for several years by not moving forward with adequate funding, and now it's costing us a lot. I would hope that we wouldn't move backwards on that. We have bonding commitments. There was $1 billion authorized for Long Bridge, I believe, in the last iteration, for Northern Virginia, and $1 billion bond authorized for Interstate 81, which any of y'all who drive Interstate 81 recognize we need to do that. So with that, I welcome your questions or your comments about where you think we should go. And at any rate, thank you all for the opportunity to present here. Okay.
Remember, I'm Mike Hankins. I'm on Board of Supervisors. Most of us that serve on the Board of Supervisors begin county budgets. We'll get input from the various departments, together budget plan. We'll try to keep it as thin as possible because we don't want to put undue tax burdens on the people who live in the county. We'll have a public hearing. We'll get all that approved, then we'll approve the budget. Then the state comes along and issues unfunded mandates. And that blows our budget out of the water every time it happens. Is there anything that can be done for, first off, to stop it? And if you can't stop it, to allow the county at least a minimum of 18 months to put in a plan on how it's going to be paid for. It's just not the right thing to do, to say, you got to do this and you got to figure out how to pay for it. Thank you.
I will respond just on K through 12 funding. I have a new perspective in the last few years because my daughter's moved back into the area and is teaching 8th grade math. And in Fairfax County, she will get maybe a 2% salary increase, even though the state said 5%. You guys just gotta make up the difference without what you've just said, the resources, so that as we look at these largesse of the state, we have got to target it in a way that is really a partnership. I had a meeting 4 or 5 years ago with the incoming governor, or maybe it was just 2 years ago, as I started my quest to get equalized taxing authority, and we were looking at more of a recession issue at that point. And it was interesting to me that Aubrey Lane, who was sitting in the room, as well as the governor, were really stepping back as I made the case that, look, in 2008, the way in which you balance the state budget was to freeze the local budgets. And look at the local ability to raise funds by the restrictions that we have put on their taxing authority. They don't have the flexibility that the state does to look at various even though we are over-reliant on the individual income tax and not relying enough on the retail sales tax, we have far more flexibility, including saying to the localities, well, we're going to stop giving you money because we're all in, we have a problem, and assuming that you all don't have a problem. And your point is well taken. It's one of those things that is a ongoing challenge for the legislature, who years ago when I was secretary, I forgot to introduce the governor, and I was down in Hampton Roads, and I said, before I introduce the governor, I'm sorry, I'd forgotten to introduce people like Hunter Andrews and other leaders, saying, before I introduce the governor, because after all, governors come and go, let me introduce the really important people in this room, being speaker and majority leader and president of Senate, et cetera. We have to take care of it ongoing. So unfortunately, when the governor comes forward with his budget, he's only got 4 years and he's looking to do it right now. So your 18 months is well said, well focused, and is something that I think we need to move to in certain areas. But in other areas, I think we just need to be far more targeted in where the help really does the most good, as opposed to some of these, well, you've got to match it or we're not going to do it.
Obviously, your point is well taken. One of the things that does help, y'all have excellent representatives from VACO in terms of the lobbying that's done. And so I'd have to say that generally speaking, we don't just make these decisions because we didn't understand. We do it in spite of that, I guess. Okay. So that it's a tough one. In fact, a good point was brought to my attention earlier this morning and that goes back to the comp board with authorized positions in the sheriff's department versus the amount that y'all really have to put out there in order to provide for the safety of your constituents. In that, when we gave the bonuses, if you will, they were based on you all sharing, but we didn't take into account the actual total number of individuals that y'all had on force. It was just, a number from the compensation board. So yes, we just need to continue a dialogue on that.
And just to
John Hinkle,
real briefly, I just want to follow up on one piece because I think it's important. You mentioned VACO's lobbying. So last year in the last General Assembly session, VACO lobbied hard to suspend the local match requirement on the teacher compensation increases. In other words, the state already had in their budget how much the 5% was going to cost the state. Why not just send that to the local governments without requiring that year a local match, understanding that local governments had tremendous fiscal constraints that they were dealing with? And is that a possibility in looking at future budgets that we could suspend the local match requirement temporarily to help localities?
Yeah, that would be honesty in budgeting, I guess. It's like sometimes we want to do a 5%. We only have a certain amount of money, so we do it for like 9 months of the year, and then it appears that's what we did, but we didn't really.
And often our ability to do this is driven by an economy that's driving the income tax revenue and retail sales tax revenue, whereas you've got the real estate market that right now, up until this last month, has been up, but those things are often not in sync. So your surpluses and our surpluses sometimes are really on different tracks.
John Hinkle, Appomattox County. Just a side comment, working 12 years in Army budget, you're right, there is no, your comment already went by, there is no truth in budgeting. so to speak. Big question or big problem in our county is, could some of that surplus, or what is the state legislature going to do about the fact that there is only one state juvenile mental health facility? And so we have sheriff officers, they're sitting up to 96 hours in emergency rooms waiting to transport a minor that they can't do anything with because there is no vacancy at the hospital. This takes road deputies off the road and causes other kinds of problems.
Can I start? I really have been privileged with the challenge of being on the Deeds Commission since its formation. And what you are speaking to is so real. And it's real because both of what COVID has done to literally under the stress multiply mental health incidents, doubling them, suicides doubling, especially of young people. We have a very, very, very serious problem. But let me, with the question being on surplus, what are we going to do about it? I want to first say just these three things which add to what Senator Hanger was saying. Way back in the day when I was Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety, by the way, ladies, it took two men to do the job. They've never put it back together again. But having said that, when we were recruiting state police back in the day, it was common to have years beyond high school, often 2 years of higher education beyond high school. Now the recruitment class for state police is picking up GEDs because there is no market for it, and that has nothing to do with COVID. It has everything to do with 2 decades of not having competitive salaries. Translate that to mental health. As we were told, I think most graphically, you open up a Amazon warehouse distribution center in the region and we lose half of our floor staff because not only are the salaries more competitive, but the working conditions, despite what you've heard from Amazon being on the line, are safer than what we're dealing with in our mental health hospitals. So you add that lack of competitive salaries to what we've got to do in restructuring our mental health system so that we really have community mental health services that are jointly funded by local and state government, so that you really do preventative and you don't end up into always turning to and crisis our state mental health hospitals, which we depend upon far, far more than most states. Most states have far more robust community mental health under the needs. But let me address then the third one that I would put in this big three. On occasion, I have felt that McAuliffe has exaggerated a little bit in his robust salesmanship. So when he came out with the fact that we had the lowest teacher salaries compared to salaries in the state, I'm thinking, oh, that's an exaggeration. Lo and behold, it's absolutely true, as also documented by PolitiFact on the Pinocchio scale. This is absolutely unacceptable. So even though I gave you a tax package where we could make up for the sales tax on removing it on food, for putting it on services, my package when I drafted it was all about putting it into K through 12, where we haven't addressed it. And if we have that kind of robust money into K through 12 that we need to have, then some of the pressure for mental health and law enforcement can be funded more appropriately out of the general fund needs that we have. So that's a rather broad answer, but all of these things have circles within circles.
I would add two things that I'm committed to in relative to that. One, crisis intervention centers. I see Barbara Favola, Senator Favola was here, or she was back there. She and I hope to work on some, and it will require additional funding to basically deal with some of that. The other issue that you spoke to is we need an alternative system, and we've already put in place some alternative transportation systems, throughout the state, but we need alternative systems for custody of the individuals and transportation rather than taking the time of law enforcement in those situations. I remain committed to the fact that we need to downsize our institutions, whether they be for adults or juveniles, but we've got to get ahead of the curve on implementing additional services through community-based services. And so that's what we need to do, and we need to pay for it. Yeah.
Got time for one more?
Welcome, sure.
Hi, Neil Morgan, York County. First, little positive reinforcement for the senator and the delegate. We really appreciate how you all have looked out for counties and local government over the years. It's very important to us. My question has to do with the comp board. It's kind of obscure and abstract for a lot of us. The way we experience it in local government is there's just some kind of sausage making that occurs, and then it shows up as a mysterious revenue source of some unknown amount after our budget process is done. I was just curious, I believe, Senator, you mentioned you wanted to take a look at how that worked. I was just curious if you could just share a little bit more about what you'd like to see happen there.
Okay. Well, Dr. Watts may have more specifics, but in general, I really think when I don't understand things, I find it more convenient to just try to eliminate it and start over. So that's my attitude about the comp board and VITA. I don't know if y'all might not have as much impact from VITA, but that's a big deal with people with state agencies. But I share, the concern that we need to do something. Vivian, you want to add to that as far as the comp board? Are you a fan of the comp board?
I would still like to believe that Virginia has a more rational, business-like approach to government than many states do. I would like to believe that. And so when it comes to efficiency and all of the databases and how they need to be integrated and kept up to date and talk to each other, when it comes to the tax department's administration of all of the funds that they have to collect and project and how it goes, that this is what we've got to assume, that if it can be done better, by God, we've got a history of doing it better. And we are ranked as one of the best fiscally managed states, and we ought to live up to that ranking and not kind of coast because in the past it's been good. So when you have the specific problems, we need to identify them. Two specific problems that right now concern me. One of the most volatile aspects of revenue and looking at the state budget in projecting it is the non-withholding income tax. And it's composed of capital gains off the stock market, individual self-employed people who are paying quarterly, and maybe home sale. I don't know all of what it's composed of, and it's all lumped under one, and yet it's so volatile. We need to break it up so that we understand how the economy, as we're putting together a 2-year budget, may affect that particular revenue stream is just one of those concerns that I have. But the other thing that I want to just put out as a factoid, because in my mind, it relates, and that is in this debate about our surplus. It was just a few years ago when the state of Virginia, who's had the AAA bond rating since it was established, was put on a watch list, because our revenue surplus was just mediocre, in the middle of the pack among states. And to have a AAA bond rating, you needed to have more reserves and various accessibility to those reserves, especially in 2-year budgeting. So as I hear the debate right now about all this big surplus, which is, the revenue is different than we thought it would be. But by the same token, there's a big chunk of that surplus that is necessary for what I just said as far as our bond rating, and also because I've forgotten now the acronyms, but the most recent COVID funding goes through 2025. So when we decided not to allocate all of it, that was a wise decision as we looked at what would be most effectively added to as far as, let's just stay with K through 12, as far as when some of the kids who haven't had access to broadband are now back in the classrooms, and how many years is it really going to take to make up their education deficit with or without our expansion of broadband to deal with that in the future. So those are all, to me, aspects of, I still want to believe that we can and should fix these things.
Good afternoon, Julie Briskman, Loudoun County, Virginia, Algonquian District. Can you hear me?
Better, thank
Okay,
you.
great. My question is about the corporate tax rate. The Finance Steering Committee yesterday received the work group update on the, let me see if I say it right, the mandatory unitary corporate reporting tax rate. You were on the work group. So I'd like to hear why the work group decided not to pursue that. And also, would it be intriguing, and I know this is a pie in the sky idea, but would it be intriguing to consider a national minimum corporate tax rate to resolve the race to the bottom that we have between states, similar to what we did on the international level with the OECD recently? Thank you.
So let me start at the end of your question, a national minimum corporate tax rate. As far as the national corporate tax rate, there is very, very significant movement after years of negotiation, particularly with the EU and other advanced countries, for a 15% worldwide minimum tax rate so that you don't have the competition between countries on that basis. And that's well underway. So now back to our state corporate income tax. One of the challenges with the state corporate income tax in, again, I'm going to say today's economy, different from Smithfield Foods and Norfolk News Shipbuilding as they were established in Virginia, it is rare that a corporation doesn't operate on a multi-state basis. So once you get into a multi-state basis, unlike the federal corporate income tax, when you can look at the activity in all 50 states and then they begin negotiating internationally about how you treat trademarks and all of that other sort of internal things that sometimes games have been played with, when it comes state to state, it's more difficult. So Amazon came to me 2 years ago and said, what we want is a mandatory unitary combined tax corporate liability. And that meant that there are 29 states, and naively, because I'm the chair of finance, newly named, okay, sure, yeah, I'll put that in, but I'm no guarantee. Well, 29 states, yeah, but each state does it differently. There is no unitary. The Multi-State Tax Commission is coming up with possible unitary, but the states that don't have it are our direct competition states, basically in the Southeast. Maryland had a 5-year study and rejected it. We had a 1-year study where I was able to get 15, 16 front office corporate tax experts from Dollar Tree, from Smithfield, from VeriSign, which is an international internet group, from financial groups like Capital One, et cetera. Get people with more than minimum of 10 years experience in the front office, many 20, 25 years professional history, to be on that work group and really talk about what it is in Virginia's tax structure that causes problems and creates loopholes. Do you tax where something is sold or where the contract is written? And I could now go into more and more details. We decided that at this time we would not go that route. Although in December we will have a preliminary report from Tax Department of whether or not there might be revenue gains from it. What if there are revenue gains? There will of course be winners and losers in those revenue gains, which is why the Secretary of Economic Development was also on this particular work group. The work group's report is got a lot of information in it. We've set a good groundwork for what we need to consider, but let me close with this. One of the things that really came on home, actually, I've got to close with one other thing. One of the things that really came on home, that when you hear about the Delaware tax shield and how you're selling trademarks because you got them in Delaware, and we've closed that long ago. Granted, it's in budget language, and there's reason why it probably won't be in statute this year because there's 3 outstanding tax suits, and we may not act on that, but we've closed that loophole. The loopholes that have been of 2 decades ago really are not part of our corporate tax structure. One of the reasons for corporate tax over time being less of our budget is, quite frankly, once again, the legal structure of how business is done. Whether it's done as a subchapter S corporation or a partnership or a pass-through or whatever, all of those models are things we need to pay attention to make sure that they don't have loopholes in escaping tax liability, as opposed to just assuming that business is taxed with corporate tax as opposed to all of these other structures that are set up mostly for legal liability, but sometimes, as you keep track of it, as to how they might treat their investments in business model as to escape tax liability. So it's very detailed. And what are we doing in it? I mean, this is something that a regular legislator is supposed to know about. I will close, as I've been throwing in humor, as I started talking about this with a number of corporate folks. One of them said, well, at least you know when we're talking about offshore taxation that this bill doesn't belong in the Agriculture and Conservation Committee. So it's very, very complex in answer, and just simply looking at tax rate and not looking at how you determine tax liability is much more of the challenge.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. So we're going to get to the 2 last questions. We just need to make them quick so we can respect the time here and try to wrap up by 12:45. Andrea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to say you're the gift that keeps on giving. This discussion is absolutely necessary for us to do an even better job with our jobs. I want to say to you, Senator Hanger, thank you so much. But one thing that you just said is common sense governing in your remarks. And I think that's where we are right now in this climate. And then I want to say collectively to both of you, Delegate Watts and to the Senator, one of the things that we talked about earlier was the mental health piece. And that's something that I ran on, and I don't want to personalize this because it is not a personalized thing. The mental health piece as a top priority is essential because it's not just for the disadvantaged, it's for all of us with the stress levels, with COVID and all that, to make it a top priority. And so I would implore you, please, as you look at your top priorities, make that one of them. That would benefit the land in Virginia to continually make us the best place to live and to work and to survive. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. I'll just thank you for your comments and say we have made a commitment, initial commitment of $76 million additional dollars forward into the next budget. And it's going to take more than that, but thank you for your commitment to the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Hanger and Delegate Watts. I touched base with you on this question, so feel free to comment for the audience. And Senator Hanger, on December 1st, the school committee, bipartisan school committee, that's been meeting all year long will have their 4th meeting. It's anticipated that they'll be making a recommendation for how the state of Virginia is going to address schools in need of capital modernization and renovation. Assuming that's going to be a rather large figure that they recommend be considered in the budget for the next several years and into the future, I'm interested in knowing, and I'm sure others are here, what's your thoughts on how we're going to fund that to get it started and then for future years out? Thank you.
You know, sir. Well, I'll make my comment, and I kind of alluded to it in my initial remarks, that we've made some exceptions for local funding through the additional 1% on the sales tax. My personal opinion is it still should be, as far as the capital expenditure, should be a local type issue rather than a state responsibility. But the funding should come proportionally from the state. So I think we need to look at the sales tax, additional sales tax, and I would suggest statewide an additional 1% is $1.4 billion under current flow of funding. That's the most recent number I've looked at, $1.4 billion from 1% on the sales tax. We could do that and then allocate it back to the localities through a revised composite index would be one way of doing it. But the state will have to share in that. But because of the circumstance for how local governments have addressed that in the past, some of it have already dealt with it in various ways, others have not. Some, there are disparities in ability to pay. I really think it should come from a statewide funding source and allocated back based on a revised composite index.
I know the need to be short on this, but I grew up in Michigan where you had the millage taxes to fund the schools where the voters had to by referendum decide. And it was a mess. And early on in my motherhood, legal women voters, excuse me, I figured out how long I would have to live in my house, which was essentially median price for my jurisdiction, if all of my real estate taxes went just to the local cost of paying for my 2 kids' education. And it was a 30-year payback. Police, fire, parks, everything else, somehow mental health now. So that this is the problem that I have whenever we are going towards referendum, and certainly the idea that was floated in the last couple of months that any real estate tax increase would be by referendum. That is not the way that we can govern, because unfortunately, people don't keep that perspective just for their own payback, not to mention their obligation to society as a whole to build for the future on dealing with some of these problems. So that's my overview philosophy. I look forward to reading the study on the funding. My initial reaction is that's not the way to go. You have localities who are absolutely back against the wall, somehow with very little economic base within that locality, that think they're going to get something from an additional 1% sales tax. If I live next to 81, that's not a bad bet because I'm picking up some non-residents. But for many of the localities that I'm looking at, that's not a stable way to fund 20-year bonds. So I will look forward to what they have decided, but off the top, my first reaction is that should be a major chunk of our current surplus that we're dealing with.
Okay. All right. Well, let's give them both a round of applause again. Talk about taxes and budgets, there's a lot to disagree on, but I hope we can all agree that these 2 legislators care about what's going on at the county level and care enough to always give us their time, and we greatly appreciate it. Just as a reminder, you will be getting an email with a survey. I know VACO is looking for input from you on the sessions that you attend, so please make sure you provide input about this session. And with that, we are concluded. Thank you.